Um, all right, well, just to start this off, I guess this is what you would call a late breaking session. I had originally submitted this based around workflows for software through to publishing, but Dan Katz approached me at about the same time as we had a meeting at AGU. And anyway, Dan said there was similarities in what we were doing to his session. So we've now moved the software through to publication bit, and that'll be in that session tomorrow. But what we wanted to focus on here is something that's been bubbling for some time, and that is the connection and the new requirements for researchers who are publishing a paper to be able to produce the data in a file that is in a registered repository linked with a DOI and a landing page. And to many of us who are actually in the data field, that's not an issue. But I can assure you, particularly if you're in the long tail community, where people are not used to or just used to putting their data as an Excel spreadsheet or a file in a supplement, this was quite a shock to people's systems. And this came out of a project, and Kirsten's going to give you all the background, so I won't go too much into it. But it came out of a project that actually got the publishers, the researchers, or some researchers, the funders, and the repositories all in the one room to talk about how we would implement such a system. I work part-time for the Australian Research Data Commons, which is the big data infrastructure in Australia for research data, and they argue that was an absolute first. No one had ever done that. So those are the issues that are going to capture us. Because when we had our meeting of this COPDESS association, which has been going for quite some time, trying to connect publishers to data to researchers, a lot of issues bubbled out at AGU. And so we thought, well, can we have a bit of a more focused meeting, whereas instead of everyone sitting around in a room for an hour going, which is kind of what happened, we actually set up something that's more structured to determine what the issues are and develop a path forward. The second key issue, which we will do towards the end of this, was that when we were running that fair data project, we had already decided that ESIP would be the home and that we would set up this COPDESS cluster. But to date, we haven't really done much on it, only because we're too busy finishing off the project. But there is a need, and so if we are to continue with this cluster, what are the things that we can do within ESIP? Well, do we use ESIP as a sounding board to get better coordination and organisation? And so that's basically a rundown of what we'll be presenting in this session. So I'm now going to hand over to Kirsten, and she's going to run through the history of COPDESS, the project, and what the key issues are that have come out so far. Now, we're going to, while she's starting, I'll actually distribute. I think we've got enough to have a set of post-it notes for each of you. And so if you think of an issue that you want a field that should be raised, write it down, because we want to try and capture all these issues as they emerge. Thank you.
Yeah, this is, for such a small group, it's always such a weird setting. What? You have slides, right? I was going to say we could use the handheld mic, but you should have. But I need to advance, right? But I want to get rid of this. Yes, that works. So I just wanted to briefly run down a history of COPDESS and what's going on right now, and much of that was already in what Leslie presented. Whoops. So why is this not advancing? Bing, bing.
Now it should work.
Oh, interesting. So COPDESS And Leslie basically explained that already. COPTESS was established to build a better communication between relevant stakeholders in the field of publishing and publishing data as part of the research endeavor. So we tried to bring together publishers, editors, funders, and data repositories and work on issues how data repositories collect data that are part of publications, or how authors should submit their data to repositories, and how that can be coordinated with journals, and what role funding agencies can play, and so on. So COPTESS goes back actually was created based on some activities that I had started in around 2007, 2008 for the field of geochemistry, in talking to editors about what to do with data in publications. So we had a workshop funded by NSF and the Sloan Foundation in 2014, where we founded this group. And the important thing at the time was we had a facilitator there and discussed what type of organization this effort should be. And the consensus really in the group was at the time, it doesn't need an organization, a formal organization with governance and so on. It should just be a forum where people can exchange about their issues, about new developments, and try to organize themselves around data. And I think it is time to actually rethink this, and the move of COPTESS to ESIP presents an opportunity to say what do we need to revise the structure of ESIP, of COPTESS. So we had a second workshop a year later where we went deeper into guidelines for publishers, how to deal with data. And shortly after that, this Enabling Fair Data project was funded by the Arnold Foundation that AGU has been leading and Shelley has been leading. And that over these years between 2017 and 2019 really moved the community forward with establishing much more detailed guidelines, policies, and the whole ecosystem around data in publications actually evolved substantially. Data citation was defined with principles and so on. And then actually, as part of this Enabling Fair Data project, the decision was made to move COPTESS into ESIP to give it sustainability. And this is just a summary with what was achieved. The workshops I mentioned, and we've had since COPTESS started regular meetings, sort of hour-long or 2-hour-long breakfasts very early in the morning, and at other conferences as well. So this forum has actually been very active, and it has attracted quite a substantial community. After the first workshop, a statement of commitment was signed by publishers that has been sort of succeeded by a commitment statement that came out of the Enabling Fair Data project. And how many people? It's like over 100, almost 200 people signed that then. And guidelines have been developed for journals to implement data policies. And at the time, we started a COPTESS directory of data repositories. This was in the days when RE3 data had just started. We initially involved the Center for Open Science in it, but then actually started to collaborate with RE3 data on that. So I've just put up, copied 2 slides from a presentation that I gave about COPTESS in 2015, so long ago, what the goals were and what the drivers were. And it's really interesting looking at these statements, how far we've actually come over those 5 years. So these were sort of the background drivers, but looking at the commitments, promoting metadata and domain standards, promoting referencing data sets using the data citation principles and so on. All this has been driven forward through COPTESS and through the Enabling Fair Data project. Brief summary of that project. So it had meetings, it had working groups that addressed very specific items. There were prototypes put in place, and with the second stakeholder meeting was really the kickoff to implement these guidelines at the journals and create adoption both at the journals and repositories, getting the researchers involved in following these guidelines. So that was not in. So where we are right now was really reflected in this last meeting of COPTESS that we had at the AGU in December, which was, I think, the biggest attended of our meetings so far, with somewhere between 40 and 50 people in the room, with really very broad representation, international repositories, a multidisciplinary community, a range of publishers. Yeah, and there I see that some things are unfinished because my computer crashed and didn't save my my last final version of this. And relevant organizations were there. So, I mean, this really reflects the interest. And the topics that we discussed at that meeting, I think, show now that the implementation of the FAIR data has moved forward, that we're hitting challenges and real barriers to move forward because of infrastructure limitations, because of unclear guidelines that weren't, specific enough for editors, for researchers to follow those. And these are, I think, the main points here. Data citation remains a problem because data are, even if they referenced now or mentioned, the citation is not by DOI, the citations are not properly included in reference lists and so on. It is unclear whose responsibility it is to check if the citation is proper, if the data are linked to a paper. Tracking of citations is, because of some of these problems, is not happening correctly. And doesn't include the full range, which on the other hand, I remember one comment at this meeting that we're losing early adopters because what we promised with, citations of data being tracked, giving credit for tenure processes and evaluations isn't really happening. And that is frustrating to people who put effort in. And we need a better messaging of the situation that we have, that the system isn't ready yet to fully deliver what we hope it promises. A big issue is the repository finding or finder tools that are not complete, not fully tested, and researchers are still confused where to put their data. On the other hand, publishers have, because these tools didn't reflect their requirements, they have started to create their own lists of repositories that they adopt or that they recommend. The workflows are not clear and not well laid out. And I have personally, with our repository in AIDA, a lot of experiences over the last half year where things are really crunching. We We have problems in communicating release of publications versus release of data. There is a breakdown of communication at some point. There is no synchronized and integrated manuscript submission process and manuscript publication process. We still need to educate editors much more. We're getting data sent that includes pictures. I mean, the graphs from the publications, it's really unclear, and that's the last point in defining actually what needs to be deposited is not clear to editors and to the authors. And then there is the issue of, an increased workload on repositories with now the implementation happening. The stream of data can potentially increase substantially, and there are new requirements that need to be integrated into the facilities. So how do we scale actually funding or effort at the repositories to take care of the data that come in, and do we need different business models or different ways of collaborating with the publishers to allow the repositories remain at their level of quality that they really want to. So what Brooks and I and Shelley and Leslie actually have discussed in the recent months is that we really need another workshop of COPTESS, bringing the editors and repositories together and address some of these current challenges. And I think, some of the tasks would be to define the elements of the workflow that ensures that data citations are accurate, following the data citation principles, define how the process is to align and synchronize the data and manuscript review and publication, and also clarify whose responsibility which are the responsibilities and the roles within this process to make sure everybody takes care of what the expectations are. For now, I think, I wanted to point to something that Shelley made me aware of. There's a data repository selection criteria document out there on which feedback is requested until the end of this month. So that's something everybody needs to do on their own. But then we want to gather ideas for when, how we can get this COPTESS workshop underway. Where can we find support for that? Do we need support for that? Could this be an event that happens in conjunction with the next ESIP meeting or an RDA meeting and so on? And that brings me to the last question, how do we run the COPTESS cluster within ESIP? How do we ensure that we have the critical stakeholders at the table? Because ESIP meetings are not really attended by publishers and by international repositories, which are critical stakeholders in COPTESS. And we want to start a discussion on what are the pain points in implementing the FAIR data guidelines from the point of view of the repositories, from the point of view of the publishers, and from the researchers who are obviously not here. So we have a limited group today, but that might make it even more productive to really in a targeted way discuss these issues and gather your feedback. And I think everybody already got their little sticky notes to contribute. And we can also, it obviously doesn't make sense to split anybody into groups but I would like to encourage you now to start, on some of these questions so we can plan for the next steps. So I think we could maybe start with the last question first. You came to this meeting what did you expect and what would you think we can do to really take advantage of having COPTESS be part of ESIP to make it, to have impact that we really want to achieve. Any ideas? Yes, Ron.
Can I start with the initial comment? And I don't mean this to be controversial.
No.
But unless someone has previously been engaged, they're going to have no idea what the word COPDESS means.
Oh, sorry.
And so
sorry.
I think I know what it means, which is why I'm here.
Yeah.
But even today, like perhaps we would have had more participation had other people known that this was a discussion about publication and connecting publications to data sets and giving people credit. So acknowledging all the great work that has occurred through the aegis of the COPDESS designation, but providing a title that's maybe a little bit more inclusive.
Good. So let me just correct that mistake. COPTESS stands for Coalition for Publishing Data in the Earth and Space Sciences. So again, our goal has always been to ensure that publications contribute somehow to the openness of data, to use that as a way to make data accessible. And with the rise of open and fair principles, there has been a great opportunity to make sure, or to engage the publishers basically. I mean, their concerns were initially really about reproducibility, but are now to have that stamp of openness and fairness, and that helps the repositories to actually be more comprehensive with the data they have, and that's been the original driver in it.
Well, I think one thing that might be useful to the community and the publishers and repositories is I think the journals have different requirements and different status, and the higher status journals generally have more restrictive, or they want their data to be more fair. So it's a lot harder to get approved as a repository for, higher level journals, and the lower level journals don't really require it at all. And so if you don't want to have this hodgepodge of every journal has a different list, you probably need to have not just here is RE3 data with 2,000 repositories. You need sort of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 with some kind of judgment, which people aren't going to like. But I don't know how you would facilitate that.
Well, this actually, I was thinking about that earlier. I was always under the impression that the criteria or the questions that you need to respond to in the COTRUST seal certification take care of a lot of those criteria already. That do you have procedures in place that ensure long-term access to the data? Do you provide DOIs, persistent identifiers for it? Are there proper interfaces? Are there policies? Are there licenses? And so on. So that was, to me, always the critical step in getting certified with COTRUST seal to, get that check mark to say I'm now ready for publishers to be recommended as a repository. It hasn't been sufficient, obviously. There are other requirements that are more procedural. I know that Nature, for example, wants repositories to allow access to the data during the review process, but keep them private, restricted access until the manuscript is released. And that's not part of the COTRUST seal certification in some way. It's more of a procedural issue. So I assume at least, Shelley, and you may want to say something more about that data repository selection criteria effort. I have not had the time to look at it. If you think this would take care of
Thanks, Kirsten. So how to quantify, so there's over 300 repositories worldwide for the earth, space, and environmental sciences that come from a variety of different beginnings. And how do we then levy all these requirements on them based on nature, based on enabling fair data, based on core trust seal, based on, those are all really great questions and probably worthy of a conversation, as you point out. And might be good for COPDESS to do to try to combat this first item up there, to talk to what Kirsten brings up. The journals came together without the repositories and put together what they felt their common list was for repositories to be included in journals. It just rubs me the wrong way that they did that. Like, I really think the repository community should come up with a list of what should actually be approved. And we can build on some of the work we've done in COPDESS enabling fair data to do that. So frankly, I want everyone to respond to number one. And it's not a bad document. I mean, if you actually read it with an open mind, it's not a bad document, but it really comes from the wrong space. Yeah, it has like that required and recommended kind of sections. And I think if we came back and said, you know, something that came from the repository community, and I don't know that this is publishers. So AG was not invited, but Wiley was there. There we go, there's the list. A lot of people that we know within the community. DataCite did participate, Fair Sharing participated, and depending on who you ask, you'll get a slightly different variation as to what their purpose for doing this was. This was happening at the same time as enabling fair data. We had originally hoped that the repository finder tool could be that down select criteria, but when we started digging in on what was possible and where the community was, it was too early. We really couldn't make it the tool that funders and journals used to make sure they had the right repository. There is a big gap there, and that's probably worthy of a conversation. So essential criteria.
I can't enlarge it. It's the zoom in only works for the frame and not for. So, oh, maybe this here is. But then you can't see anything anymore.
For instance, when you read through this, I would really want to make sure that the richness of metadata that comes from the work that our domain repositories give us, that's included here, that how well researchers are supported by the repository. I mean, I would really try to pull in all of the really beautiful things that happen within repositories that may not have been identified here. And I would have to go dig in myself to make sure that wasn't there. But anyway, it would be really great before they implement this to, I've talked enough, to comment.
Yeah,
So one thought is that there are already criteria out there for repositories in terms of looking at their trustworthiness. There are now the new trust principles that have come out, and we've got all these instruments, ISO 16363, which could be for larger organizations that can afford that kind of evaluation, or core trust seal, and there are others that are available too. And just tagging, for instance, in R33 data, whether a repository has undertaken some kind of appraisal might be a way of at least identifying to potential depositors whether the repository is at least concerned about these issues and is doing something about them. Whether that's the same criteria that the publishers would use is another question. The science community has let the publishers drive our communications for centuries. And I'm for what people are saying, where we just leave them behind and take it over and do it ourselves. And I'm sorry if I sound like a rebel rouser, but if they're going to try to take over everything, including our data management, where does that leave us?
I'd like to comment. This is the first time I've seen this, and to see that it's been put together by the publishers, I find it a little bit concerning. Now, Bobby, you got it open? Oh.
Should I forward you something?
No, here, Bob, there's the link to it. Because what I'd like to just quickly make a comment on it, and I've had a quick look at it, is the fact that isn't this overlapping, Shelley? Isn't this overlapping parts of the core trust seal? Yeah, no, but so that's why I'm asking Bob, because he knows the core trust seal stuff inside out.
Yeah, it's not a bad list. I mean, it's just that it was the journals that
if
did
you're
it.
a repository who's just gone through the trauma of getting core trust seal, why can't we try and organise the repositories, sorry, the publishers, to accept that core trust seal? What's the difference between what you're asking for and what is there? Because if somebody's already got core trust seal, you don't want to, as a repository, have to run through this.
And that's a great comment to make on this document. And going back to Nick's comment earlier about tiers, when core trust seal, we were looking at core trust seal as a selection criteria with enabling fair data. There just weren't very many Earth space environmental repositories that had it. So it would have been devastating to our community to say you must have in order to publish, to cite your data in a journal. So that would be a preference, but I wouldn't make it a requirement. At least not for a good while until Rebecca's cohort can make it through. There is a cohort for core trust seal in case you want to join it. See Rebecca.
If I'm reading here, this article proposes a set of criteria that journals and publishers believe are important for the identification and selection of data repositories, which can be recommended to researchers. Well, I mean, does that mean they're going to set up a similar CTS process to verify which ones meet their criteria?
I think this is actually a really important aspect for this group, for COPDESS within ESIP, because we could respond to this as a common voice and say, COPDESS has looked at this, and this is what, we would suggest, make, and we could actually sit down, make that an exercise within the earth space science and environmental science community, CDF, for example, sit down, look at this and, do an evaluation of current repositories and how they would fit into this. That's a real task that we could, I don't think that's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, so looking at some of it, just having a quick look, Bob, I don't know whether you've had time to have a look. Can someone scroll it up down? Okay. So it's interesting on page 10, you're on 8, can you go down 9, 10?
Oh my goodness, that goes on.
So core trust seal, Bob, if I'm right, is on the repository. They're bringing up questions there that are related to the data that's being deposited, the file size and the cost with deposition. Anyway, what I'm arguing is that I think we should be pointing out that a lot of this does apparently overlap with core trust seal. And did the CDF community see this yesterday?
No. I mean, this is something to communicate to the CDF. I think it's.
Here we are. So Lisa Raymond's put a nice item there. Thanks.
So Lisa said, as a librarian, I have said for several years that we should not let publisher take over this process or make all these decisions.
So, sorry, what's your name?
What, Johan?
Johan. Can you go back to page 1?
Okay. Oops.
Now you get the ring.
We're going to make you earn your keep, young man. Out of that list, how many of those, Shelley, how many of those have signed the, the fair data
Commitment
statement, and then also how many of those are in COPDESS? So again, I guess, like we say, we didn't get a good turn up here, but this is the purpose of this meeting. There's a little bit of a crisis going on around us. And yeah, how do we bring this together and leverage the opportunities that having a cluster within ESIP can help us bring people together to start to work through these issues? Because I would hate to be a repository and have a look at this if I've just gone through core trust seal. Does anyone have any other comments or ideas?
Well, comments, what always comes to my mind is the, but I didn't want to take over.
I'm working at NASA Goddard, the data center justice. I'm also a research scientist myself, also data provider myself. This is my first time joining this, and can I bring out some reality that probably could be use case? I just wonder from this one, can play any role on this? We just start to kind of collecting the community, accept the community data. Just while those are non-NASA funded, or even some NASA funded, but it's kind of follow up the data set. And then when they apply to our data center, we would like to see if they have some publication there, especially from the scientific data. They have algorithm, those stuff. But at the same time, we have one case here. Someone, they are trying to write a paper to a journal, and the journal require them. So you had to find the top depository, the host, before we can publish you. So for this one here, it seems to me, okay, you can also provide some kind of help or some, you see, you try to get some guideline, what the criterion would be matter the most. But for us, we were very simple. Just like Bob mentioned with data center, we just see if you have a good, okay, the science foundation there, like paper, if you have a journal paper, peer review paper, then even we'll do some internal, we will go and invite some scientists to review this data products before we are going to accept them. Then after we accept them as a host, then they can tell the journal. So well, we will got the justice will be find out what's about there. So they probably go ahead publish the papers there. So I'm not sure what kind of role okay you can play. So even can help either one of us to do this. But for us, well, because I'm a data scientist myself, I'm a research scientist myself, I definitely know what kind of data product is usable, or I can value that. Perhaps may not need you tell me, okay, hey, this would be the criteria, of course, DOI, all those stuff. So do you play any, okay, really, okay, realistic, the role, okay, can help this kind of situation? I'm not sure this is the right use case for this effort here. Just, well, say, for instance, like some data, and they need to be find a data host. And then...
Yeah, I think that's the issue. That, well, this is what I'm getting confronted with in Australia, that people are definitely getting knocked back from publishing because they don't have a host to put the data.
I would call this catch-22.
Yeah. Now, what's of concern is that we initially started to provide guidelines as to where a repository could be. But Shelley, Kirsten, correct me if I'm wrong. What I understand the publishers are now doing is making a list of repositories that they will only accept data from. So it doesn't matter that the repository has agreed to take your data. It's then whether or not the journal has you on their list of, preferred, acceptable. I'm trying to find a polite word. Acceptable repositories. So what's causing grief amongst the repositories is that if they're not on that list, people won't put the data in that. And what's even more concerning is that what's going to be the difference, because you know about Core Trust Seal certification. So if a repository has Core Trust Seal and then gets faced with yet another list, which is what the repositories are recommending you need to meet, the repository community cannot take it.
But if every journal has a list,
yes, right. So see, so anyway.
But they...
I'm trying to understand what with this effort here can really help to some real case. Instead of saying, well, okay, you need to do this, I recommend. Of course, this I think this is the only kind of suggestive, right? It's not required, demanding you have to have this before and so on and so on.
No, it is.
Right.
I mean, that's what the purpose is.
Yeah, eventually you're going to be
required.
Right.
And I have to say that it's. I think the Core Trust Seal was such a sophisticated process to establish the guidelines that has in it what is really important. And as painful as it is for repositories to try and achieve that certification, it is critical for if data gets submitted to a system that these criteria that Core Trust Seal set up are followed, because we've seen data systems disappear because they didn't have the ideas of where the data would go when their funding was over and so on. So there are very good reasons for why Core Trust Seal has set their criteria, and it's mind-boggling to me that basically somebody, the repository, the publishers established their own ideas again. And I think, what would be really interesting from my perspective is to go through that list and distinguish, what are these operational. I mean, core trust seal is a lot about the infrastructure and operations of a repository. Does it, follow standards versus procedural issues in the publication process that are convenient for the publishers to have.
Sure.
So the repositories need to align with their procedures.
But we also, we also, sorry, but we also need to recognize the different nature, right? So many different data sets, nature, different, even different. Well, forget about even the architecture or the data format. So seems to me you try to find a common least factor, right? At least can apply. So when you try to do one, apply all, maybe very difficult. Right? So that's my question. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I try not to divert.
I think we're heading in. So I think the answer to this is it's just, we're not pointing this anymore. It's incredibly disappointing. I think they're taking us in the wrong direction. So the first one is the repository is in production. Okay, they have a heartbeat. That's great. The second one is that they make the access condition clear. Access conditions are clear. So how to access the data. Okay, that's really not hard, right?
And I think that's a core trust seal.
It is, right. But these are really low bars. I think they're dumbing down the value of a repository is what I feel like. And these are the essential criteria. It gets more interesting on the desirable criteria. The third one has to do with what the reuse conditions are. Okay, that's helpful. Page 6, bottom. Data deposition conditions, that's great. What their preservation policy is, that's great. That they assign PIDs, that's great. And that what their user support is, so how they help researchers. It's so lightweight for an essential criteria. I would rather see journals actually try harder to recognize the value of a repository. And if they're going to help the repository community, I think this list actually needs to be more in alignment with Core Trust Seal at the more detailed level. These desirable ones are really important, that we're implementing citation and reporting standards. Oh yeah, come on. That you're curating data, please, yes. That there's data versioning policy, yes. We're enabling data to article links, yes. That repository collecting and sharing the information, I think this is an openness item, collecting and sharing. Enabling access, sustainable plans. They have something here on funding, but they have yeah, it's like italic to how they're going to handle it. Contact information. Are you kidding me? I mean, really, you have to have contact information. Anyway, and on and on. I think this is actually putting us back. Yeah. And then what are they going to do with it? Like how are you going to do anything better than we're doing in these other areas? So what are we trying to do?
This is basically, this is basically the journal saying we no longer have to have supplemental information with our articles, and you put that somewhere else, so we don't have to deal with it. I mean, that seems sort of what they're offloading their supplemental information. They used to have supplemental information as included. Now they just want to offload it to somebody else. Yeah, you want that, but.
Yeah, but I mean, and this was what I was going to say earlier, is again the INR, is the real putting value into the data, the domain-specific standards, and that this is very generic. And I think that was for us with COPDESS was really looking at where are the places where are the repositories that have the domain knowledge to curate the data properly. And it brings up the issue that we don't have a good system yet to kind of endorse and govern community standards, which I keep coming back to that topic, but that to me is critical. What is the repository that really ensures the reusability of data into the future? what do we need to do for that? And that, these criteria here, I think we can all put our stuff in Figshare. Sort of, and that was the purpose why COPTESS really wanted to to emphasize we need to work with the publishers, that does not happen, that the community actually establishes or supports a structure where the data goes to the right place, to a place, that the community in paleomag, in the earth sciences, knows that.
In the end, it's the reviewers of the papers that should be saying, your data needs to be in the data repository. Where is it? And here's the best one to have, or these are the ones that I would suggest. And so where is it? And you need to do that before we'll approve the paper. And we're starting to see that occasionally now.
I'd argue, I hear what you're saying, and I think it's great, but at the AGU meeting, I don't know whether it got captured in the notes, the publishers a couple of them were really great. They were actually saying, we're trying, we think this is fantastic, but our reviewers or our editors and our reviewers mostly don't know how to implement it. And in fact, it's going to take time. So again, that's kind of one of the issues that we thought we could bring to COPDESS to ESIP is, like you've got a training scheme, but we extend training to have some materials for editors and reviewers to work through. I can't remember which journal it was. They were very good. And they said at that meeting, they said, oh, well, what we're going to do now as part of the pre-editorial process, we will check that the...
There was the American Astronomical Society as
no, I was just going to say, anyway, this group one of them had, as part of the pre-check that they did in the journal, not before it went out to the editors or the reviewers, to ensure that a paper was worth editing, that the data set did have a DOI landing page, etc.
Yeah, I mean, what this person from the AAS reported on was that they actually support a data person in their publishing process who kind of makes the recommendations. So they have an employee, and I talked with him a little bit about also, the publishers supporting a curator within the repository community to take that role and recommend to the authors where to submit the data and so on. So to have sort of a supported, curated process in there. That's clearly a model that could be implemented or at least suggested. But it was a nice example that you can think differently.
Actually, I tried to ask this question. I think also important how we're going to convey all this to the data producer themselves, right? Because, well, when you just stop them at the review paper, that probably is a bit too late for them. For instance, they just say, well, for instance, for my case, I mentioned myself as a data provider. I didn't join this, and I even don't care what kind of data format I'm put in there. When I provide my data, I put it in the nature binary. But when I give them, they say, oh, you should be HDF or NetCDF. I even don't know what is HDF, NetCDF. So for those science, also myself also review many science paper. I will never care what kind of data. I will only care about data quality. This is scientific, make sense. So I think so when we're talking here, when we only educate the publisher, probably that's a later age. Probably will also need to convey to all the scientists. They are up there. Okay? They are the one in the end of the day, they are the one produce the data. So if they don't really know all this kind of policy or whatever requirement, then just kind of will prolong the review procedure, right? So I think that's probably also you need to include. So every now and then I suggest for the data community like this, I always invite them. I also suggest we need to invite more scientists to the year. So when the data science, now I call myself hybrid scientist because I'm a kind of data scientist and not research scientist. So we need to talk to each other. Only if you only set up the rule requirement, then you dump to them. Then we just, what's going on? I just want to care about the science, right? So yeah, that's probably at the same time we also need to extend our the audience. Not until they say, well, all rules have been set, then it just showed to them, and they say, hey, you have to follow this. Then I think many of the valuable science paper or science data probably will be delayed or somehow. That doesn't matter.
I mean, I agree. We need to reach the science community better. It's just a question how, you know, and
I mean,
they're not going to come to another meeting like ESIP. That's not on their agenda, and that. And right, I mean, at AGU, the data fair, you know, we had the presentations about the repositories, and it's minimal attendance because it conflicts with. So to me, always actually the implementation of rules by the publishers is the most effective means to get people to deal with their data. And
I think
it was, sorry.
maybe even more effective is the funders. So
But the
NSF,
funders works on a national basis.
right, so
that's-
NSF does have, if you're funded by NSF, you've got to write a data management plan. And so if NSF, and they seem to be coming on board with these ideas, and they're funding a lot of stuff to do data. They have EarthCube, they have all these initiatives. And if in that data management plan, you had, it required that you go to a repository of some type and talk to them ahead of time before the grant and get approval for the data that's going to go in, just like you have collaborations for, you have these collaboration letters, right, that you include when you're going to like do rock dating with somebody if you're doing some other science, and they say, yes, I'm going to support them and so on. If they required that for data, then people would be thinking about where their data is going to go before they do the science, because this is a real problem. After you're done, then the data is already in a format in a way that's not necessarily going to go into a repository very easily.
Just like when you write an article, you decide where you're going to publish it before you write your article, because then you're going to focus it towards that audience.
I have to say that
exactly.
for us, 80% of the data currently coming in is not from the US. So NSF doesn't help me as the repository, and it, you know, the publishing world is international. So it, you know, it's definitely an important and necessary step.
I just want to comment on the NSF side since I was there for 2 years. So I think the point of leverage there's the NSF-wide requirements, and then there are also directorate level and division level data policies. Those are relatively rigid and difficult to change. Where there is a possible point of leverage is with individual programs. Periodically, program managers will revise their solicitations, and there are many solicitations now that explicitly include directions to PIs about the choice of repositories. Sometimes they're very specific, sometimes they're a little bit more vague, or they allow more possibilities depending on the nature of that program. So that's a point of, I mean, obviously it's only 20% of the people submitting articles if you're considering the international focus, but talking to those program managers for those specific programs about trying to update those guidelines is a potential way to make this move forward.
So at AGU, any question that comes from an author that has the word data in it comes my way, pretty much. And going back to your point, the authors are getting caught off guard with the new policies at AGU. We implemented on August 1st that all your data is going to be in a repository. So the questions that are coming back are, what does that mean exactly? What data? Because all is not a good way to describe it. And the second question is, which repository? So the editors have no idea. And handing them the repository finder tool, something that's really tuned to vocabulary of the informatics community, has been beyond frustrating. They're done. So I can't even hand them that tool anymore. Like, all right, got it. So I'm having individual meetings with every editor. Now, consider the fact that we're, walking from the broad Earth, Space, and Environmental Science community down to a specific journal with specific interests. Many of them are domain specific, so that helps. But even when I try to, and I will now do this one at a time, and I will reach back to COPDESS and I will reach back to ESIP for support. But by journal, they're looking for a repository list. So it's a very different way of thinking about it. But nonetheless, that's the plan, and I need something that's international.
No, I think that's a good plan. I mean, there are obviously journals like Nature that cover huge, I mean, the broadest range of sciences, but there are many journals like tectonics or chemical geology that will have just a limited number of repositories that, with a few exceptions maybe of articles that pertain to something, but probably 90% can be covered by just a short list. That is a really good way to.
The first one is actually tectonics, Friday. I'm meeting with tectonics.
Yeah, tectonics has been. Do
you have my list?
We've actually EarthChem, which handles chemical data, has been getting a lot of data sets from tectonics that have nothing to do with us because the editor decided it was a good repository, obviously, and has been sending the authors to us, who we have to say no, sorry,
Okay, so you'll benefit from this list.
Yes.
Oh, no.
I think data repositories have that. They have journal lists of all the things that are in their repositories, so they could just print out that list and sort it, and you'd have a list.
Can I just ask, look at this. It's like thank you. Could I just ask repositories for their journal lists and flip it? Holy crud. Who knew? Finally, I've met you. The answer is in front of me. Okay, so is that is it an email? I can hold that. I'm sorry, that's weird.
How many repositories have the citations?
A lot, because they have to prove their funding.
A lot of them do.
They have to prove their funding, so they have to
Yeah,
demonstrate
and generally there's a citation associated with I mean, maybe not.
So if I write a short note.
Try it. We do.
Why not, right? You can do it. Okay. What's my mailing list? Like, is it CDF? Is it I could do the Enabling Fair Data mailing list. I can do ESIP data steward. I do all of them. I will do all of them. I will send the request. Hello, I need help. We're trying to match journals to repositories. Can you send me your journal list for your repository and we'll reverse match? Associated with your repository. Okay, so here's the bugaboo. If I do this and I make this publicly available to the authors of these journals, that means the authors will go there, which means the work will increase. Okay, that's the problem.
I mean,
in the last few years, several new journals have popped up. And so we analyze our data citations and we see that there are all these new journals for the last 2-3 years that weren't on the list previously. So thinking towards the future, one can expect that the number of new journals is going to increase. So if you get a list from people today, it's not going to contain all the articles that are being targeted for publication in the near future.
So you're taking the AGU 22 journals and expanding it to the 10,000 international journals, which is what I intend to do. If I make this list, I'm going to make it public so that any tectonics journal will have the list of repositories. Not only do I want to help us, I want to help everyone, by the way, in case
So
you wanted to know.
what you just said about increasing workload, that's something
It's real.
I had mentioned before and in my slide. You know,
Yeah.
because just the implementation of the FAIR principles in the last 6 months, the data submissions to EarthChem have quadrupled. So that's something we need to address as well. You know, because I mean, it's great that we're getting these submissions, but they are in bad shape because people don't know how to submit, and there is no support somehow at the very beginning that might have to come from journals to say this is the way how, you know. So anyway, it's happening. This
but with
increased burden is already there.
But for your point exactly, if we make this connection between repositories and specific journals with their specific authors, then we also created the group of, so one of the things that came out of COPDESS and the work is the value of the repositories curation practices for specific communities in order to make sure the data was as good as it could be. And you have materials to help your researchers that come to you. And if we give you that community, granted you're getting it through the journal, here's our authors, here's dear authors, here's your repository, here's your training class before you submit. Make sure you get your data correct.
Number of we have 4,000 papers with data. So if you sort that by the number, then the most popular journals come up first. And I don't know if, like, if a journal ends up saying, okay, there's 73 repositories, and that's not nearly as useful as if there's 5 that are good. So that's sort of the harder
But this is an issue because speaking from Australia, first world country, Kirsten gets a lot of geochemistry data from New York, sorry, to EarthChem, because we don't have a repository. We don't have domain repositories. We didn't go for them. Went for the big ones and for the institutional ones. And so this is another unintended pressure point, is that what 80% of the stuff being submitted to EarthChem now is not from within the US. So who's funding that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is.
Okay, so you say reduce that load. If you reduce that to a set number, then for heaven's sakes, tell those repositories that you're reducing it, because they probably aren't ready to take this data. So this is, again, what we were trying to do within this group is bring out all the unintended impacts, and these are ones that are emerging.
You need to tell them what you're going to do, and they like phrase it like, if you want to be on this list, or, you know, if you, I don't know the best way to deal with that. Yeah, I'll send you.
It's again, it's.
And you, yes. Yes.
We shouldn't leave the research community out there, because they also have a stake in this, in, you know, how many repositories they need to use, or if there is just one that does it. I mean, in many ways, I feel that, you know, especially representing a small community, geochemistry is, I mean, it is pervasive in the earth sciences, but it's not a very huge community. I'm scared that every country is setting up their own geochemical data repository, and then, you know, it gets really highly fragmented across everything. What steps could we take to help build international, you know, more international collaboration on these things? I mean, one of the most powerful data facilities I know is GBIF. You know, that's an international effort that is so useful, because everything from the globe on species can be found at one place, right? Do we really need, 10 different seismic data repositories and so on? What can we do to support that? And I think the collaboration with the publishers and establishing business models with the publishers who work on an international scale may ultimately be, a way. But I mean, these are discussion points that we need to drive forward at something like a workshop or future meetings, right? When we're not solving this here. And so I want to turn back to my original slide there, because I think we're also, well, we have 15 minutes to come out of this with, some ideas of the next steps. Yeah, when that's a great idea. Thank you. I think we need to become clear on these pain points. And maybe we need to do this in a more distributed manner that doesn't require us all maybe to get into the same room and talk. Usually I feel that workshops are most effective when it comes to planning something for the future, rather than just gathering information that can be done in a different way. We have actually talked a little bit in the last day or so about setting up a half-day workshop in conjunction with the next ESIP. The question will be, how do we get the publishers and how do we get a more international community of repositories to be at that workshop? The CDF always meets in conjunction, so I think we have enough repositories there. When is it actually, Erin? August or July? July?
Do you already have some active publishers or whatever, or you can, then you probably can start from there, right? Yeah, and also in terms of this, because I also doing the metrics about how users use our data. Okay, I try to apply to here. Yeah. So for this kind of the publishers or the repository, okay, whatever, just you mentioned so many hundreds of publishers there. So do we doing some inventory, okay, or some kind of metrics to measure, okay, how they perform? Okay, what, yeah. Pardon? It's horrible. Yeah, horrible, yes, right? So see, so anyway, horrible or good, we always can learn lesson from that. So maybe if we can organize that, kind of analyze it on that first, and gather all the things we have. Just like I mentioned, just who are the publishers already actively involved, and those things we can start from there, kind of form a focus group, and then you can start from there.
So they have their own.
Pardon?
They have their own, but they're not doing well. So right now there's a variety of issues happening on the publishing side. So just taking the signatories for enabling fair data, there's a group called STM. I forget what it stands for, but it's an international community, an association for publishers, and they've stood up a whole new community to develop a dashboard to see how well publishers are generating data citations coming through the workflow, Crossref and DataCite and Scholix. So they're heading that way and putting money into it, and essentially I would support them on that because they've already got investment and they're going to do it internationally. They represent primarily the commercial publishers, so the Elsevier's and Science and such, not Science, Elsevier and Wiley. Yes, thank you. There we go. Lagging behind are the society publishers because they're not in the same place yet culturally, but we are.
Financially.
Well, yes, but they're not even talking about data citation. Like they're not even taking big basic steps. So we do have a society a meeting of societies that we started from a grant from the National Science Foundation. We had their first meeting this last June. They're really at basics. But I did ask for a no-cost extension on the grant, and I've got enough money to do a co-located meeting at a society, a meeting where they'll be. So the Council for Science Editors will meet, and the Society for Scholarly Publishing will meet, and that's where they come to. So I'll hit them there. Probably in it won't be 2020. It's probably gonna be 2021, just because of timing. One of them is at the same time as EG, one's at the same time as JPG. So we couldn't make it this year, but we'll do online stuff this year with them. They have so much work to do that that's probably okay. But STM does have the metrics. So the problems, here's the problems. So within the scholarly process, first of all, communicating to a researcher what they need to do, we already know that's an issue. There's just gaping holes on guidance and checklists, and so that's an area COPDESS can help in. Then the publisher has to get all of that coded correctly within their system. Most of them use a format called JATS. JATS is managed by NISO. NISO's meeting next week. I'm going to that. I'm speaking actually at their session. The data citation is not pushed hard enough within the community such that it's actually captured correctly with the DOI and everything else. So that's an issue. We don't have that figured out within the process well enough to do it consistently, because it's hard for our community to recognize what the data is and what's an actual decent citation. Those are just basic skill sets that haven't been built up yet. So that's a whole gap area. Then let's say we did it right, because some journals are better than others and some are doing it right. So you hit the point where you've published the paper. At that moment in time, all of the journals, no matter what domain, publish to Crossref. Crossref gathers all that information, so they're the ones that assign the DOI for the paper. They have done data DOIs in the past, but now pretty much most folks are using DataCite. The schema in Crossref, the XML schema for Crossref, we've understood about 18 months or 2 years ago. It now supports data citation correctly and software citation to identify a reference as a data citation or a software citation. Not so. We were promoting that it was there, but in reality, their internal software wasn't fully implemented yet. So, damn it. Who knew? They weren't saying that part. This we found out at RDA in Helsinki a couple months ago. So they promised to get, and mostly no one noticed because the journals weren't using it. So there was no way to measure it, and no one who could see the problem. So that was mostly the problem. Now the journals are trying to use it, and it's not really fully there. And this has to do with the event data, in case anybody's really excited about Crossref schemas. So they promised that in 2020 it would get resolved, and they also promised to add a second capability in for the journals. So that has to be fixed. There's one more piece. There's a third-party software conversion that the journals used to convert to the Crossref schema. There's like 5 or 7 of these companies that they buy services from. Not all of them are actually doing the full conversion correctly, and some of them are dropping the DOI. So each of them has to be essentially held to task to make sure they get their stuff right too. So that's where we are. And hopefully in the next few months, some of this all works out, hopefully.
But it should also be guided, I think, by the repository questions, by the researcher questions, and that is, I think, a big challenge. I was also thinking in this context that maybe we talk too often about the publishers coming together within COPDESS. I really think that editors, we need to have the conversation with editors and not with the publishers, because the experience over those years, 5 years of COPDESS, has been that there is a very high level commitment, and the problems are down in the weeds. with the editors. And I would really like to have, you know, if we're talking about inviting people to the next ESIP meeting and having a workshop there, it should be with editors and not with you know, representatives of the publishers.
I think 1,000 times agree with that, because one of the things that's been frustrating on the data fair side of things and outreach at society meetings has been that, you know, editors are doing a separate track of things. And it seems like this is exactly where we need to be pushing, but it seems like publishers have a wall up on allowing us to get to the editors. And so I'm not sure how to get through that, but you know, I think editors are exactly the right point.
I think, you know, what I've actually been personally doing is going to journals that matter for my repository, like Chemical Geology or Journal of Petrology, looking up who the editors are and contacting them directly. You know, so I think maybe, you know, within the CDF community, following along the lines of what you said, you have, you know, primary journals where people publish from your community. We say, you know, chemistry here goes here, and then paleomech goes there, and seismology goes there, and pulled some editors in. Usually they are the buddies. The editors are also the researchers who submit data, who write papers, right? So that might be, you know, obviously editors keep changing, but you know, establishing a structure where that dialogue can go on and the editors have a point of contact where they also know who, you know, usually they wouldn't know who to get in touch with if they have a paper that, you know, has weird data or whatever, or difficult data. So trying to work on that, maybe that should be the theme of the summer workshop is, you know.
The other thing, ask Bob, there's two things I'm attracted to that idea is, firstly, we've got usually we have the CDF meeting on the day before, so you could try and get some connection there. My other question, Bob, is we've got the CDF, which is doing really well, but all the WDS science groups in the CDF, or can we get some repository names to come in as well through that? So we sort of almost have, like, still have the CDF meeting with the repositories. I'm thinking too big maybe. Oh, okay. But anyway, we sort of got, so we've got like a COPDESS, we've got a meeting where we're trying to connect editors with publishers, with repositories with this issue, right? But have it as a half day or something, and then if they want to hang around and the CDF is willing to have them, then you've got that perspective speaking direct to the repositories from the editors, which I think would be useful for most repositories.
I just reminded me that the original editors roundtable that was sort of the precursor of COPDESS, those were actually editors. There were no publishers in the room. They were the buddies, you know, Bill McDonough and the people who actually, and that was the fruitful discussion.
So we could facilitate something like that. So within AGU, you've got sections and you've got the journals. So what first came to mind as you were kind of thinking this through is it would be fantastic to include in all of so the journals have meetings during AGU proper. It's exhausting. They're like 6:30 in the morning or during lunch, or it's all week. But we could work this year to come up with a presentation that a repository community could give to each of the journal meetings, and have that as a standard element on their agenda. And then you would have a direct connection to their editors in chief and their reviewers. Okay. The other I would also not just leave it there, because that's just one aspect, but I would hit the sections as well and try to get at a section meeting and do the same thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, we've actually made that as quite a few suggestions during the AGU fair meeting that we need to, next step is to get out, to reach out to the sections but we just couldn't make the connection within AGU. Erin? Sorry, just saying, we were trying to make connections through to the sections. And we need to get that happening.
We just finished enabling fair data, so we can go ahead and pick up a new task and head to the sections. So, but what are you going to say to them? Like, we need to prepare materials. Yeah, so that would be something we could work on at summary SIP. What is it we would say?
Okay, we haven't got much time left, so I'm still not quite sure what the concrete thing is we're doing. I'm still not quite sure what the concrete thing is we're... No, you summarise. Go for it, girl.
No, I'm not summarizing, and I'm not a girl, grandma. But I think the workshop is one action item to set that up, to start inviting editors early enough that they know. The question will be the funding to get editors to travel to that meeting. Is there a way, any idea who we can ask for the support for that? I think we decided that for point 1, we should try to come up with a joint response to that. How we basically logistically going to do that, I'm not clear, but I think it's important that we get that done. The discussions on the pain points, I think what we need to do is set up some sort of spreadsheet or, and send that out to the COPTESS mailing list to understand and do that, as information gathering outside a workshop.
We've got the foundation for that. I mean, they've got to be cleaned up because they're just still a bit rough. But the notes that were taken at the AGU meeting,
Sure. Yeah.
We could actually divide those into, if someone could tell me how to do it on ESIT. No, I'm just trying to say that we actually then say, well, here are the issues on this category, this category, this category. Has anyone got any others?
And we haven't figured out the last question, so that we need to discuss that a little more. But with that, I think we're at the end. So thank you all for your contributions and the discussion. So a small and productive group. We have, I think it did give us a good level of insight. Again, missing the publishers, but with Shelley's input, I think we had that one covered. So thanks. Okay, off to the coffee break.
Thank you to our wonderful
Yeah, thank you.